Hi, I'm Peter J Rea. Welcome to my um, welcome to my second floor lair. Today's topic is Resalest Remarkable Books number 15. Our first book today is Forrest Gump by Winston Groom, published in 1986. Of course, this is there was the famous movie with Tom Hanks, and the character is very endearing. Who he's involved in a lot of interesting things, meets famous people. And now the book is a little different. It's more complicated, and Forrest becomes an astronaut and winds up in New Guinea, of all places. Of course, he loses Jenny, who's his lady love, and Forrest is such a good fella, not too bright, but I thought the funniest part was when he ended up saving Mao Zedong's life. He was in China for ping pong diplomacy, and because he became a good ping pong player. And then Mao Zedong tried to show how strong he was to the Chinese people by swimming across the Yangtze River every year on his birthday. And of course, in the movie, he's depicted as struggling and drowning, and Forrest saved his life. And then some of the Americans said, "Forrest, why'd you do that? Why'd you say?" And of course, he's an innocent fellow and didn't really know that Mao Zedong was our enemy, actually. In the Korean War and Vietnam War, Mao's China was supplying weapons to the North Vietnamese and North Koreans, and so. Anyway, Forrest Gump, very endearing character. Like he says, life is like a box of chocolates. We never know what we're gonna get. So I like the part when he met President Kennedy and said he had to pee when he and so it was very clever story. And of course, he has the friend who had lost his legs, whom he saved, and then the African American fellow who started the shrimp business. So. I think the message of that book and movie is that character is important. People think they're very smart, but he wasn't too smart. But he was a good fellow. He's a good man. And it's very touching, his relationship with Jenny. And of course, Jenny died, and took her a long time to recognize that he was such a really a good man. She was involved with men who weren't very good. The next book is A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, published in 1912. Now, I had a friend on Guam named Dan Fenton, very good fellow. He used to always talk about Gentleman John Carter. Apparently, this is the main character is John Carter, or Gentleman John Carter, and this is another pulp fiction from the creator of Tarzan. And I stumbled through it. It wasn't that easy for me. And then it has John Carter and Deja Thoris having romance. So this is science fictional. They involve these strange, you could say it's kind of like Star Trek, or Star Wars, where you have these unusual planets and different peoples. And so, Princess of Mars, another pulp fiction from more than 100 years ago. The next book is Guam, The History of Our Island by Pedro C. Sanchez, published in 1987. Now, as I told you before, I lived on Guam for a year, and this is a very wonderful history of Guam. The largest island in Micronesia. So it's the largest among the small islands, because micro means small. And I thought this is a fascinating story, the story of Guam, because Guam is the land of the Chamorro people, and before the Spanish came, they were living their lives. They were happy people, simple people, and involved in they were in the ocean a lot. They fished and they enjoyed swimming in the ocean, and it was this tropical paradise, you could say, a very nice place, and of course not perfect, because they had I believe they had slaves and exploitation of each other. And then when the Spanish came, then it was really tough, because there was a huge population decline based on disease, that the local people weren't immune to, and then they became really a depressed people. They forgot about going in the ocean, and they were under a Spanish colony, kind of like the Philippines. became a depressed people, an oppressed people and a depressed people, and very poor, and kind of lost their ancient ways because of there been so much death. I think the population declined. 90% of the people died because of disease, and then of course so they were a real poor people, and pretty simple island people. And then when the United States came around 100 years ago, well, things really changed completely, and because the standard of living really went up, and the Americans came and really did a lot on the island. Became a lot of big military presence, and the Second World War was tough under the Japanese, So Guam has really changed a lot under the American influence. A lot of prosperity, and of course a lot of government, and folks dependent on government support. And so it's real interesting how much that island changed after the United States came. So it's a real interesting. I was glad I spent time on Guam. The next book is Bats by Davy Johnson, published in 1986. This is a book by the man he played baseball himself. Davy Johnson was a second baseman, power hitter for the Atlanta Braves. In fact, I believe he played. He was the fellow along with Hank Aaron and Darrell Evans. The only time three men had hit 40 home runs on a team, and I lost my accent here. Anyway, this is a book when Davy Johnson was the manager of the New York Mets in 1985, and he wrote about the 1985 season. So this was a little bit premature, because the following year they won the World Series. The famous 1986 Mets, who had that really interesting World Series with the Boston Red Sox. And so, they had a lot of hitters. Darryl Strawberry and Dwight Gooden, the famous pitcher, and Gary Carter, the catcher, and so forth. So they're a very memorable team. I thought this was a sequel to Balls, which was written by Greg Nettles, but it really isn't, because it's about two different teams. So the next book is The Boz by Brian Bosworth and Rick Riley. Brian Bosworth was a famous college football linebacker back in the 80s, and I think he played for the Oklahoma Sooners. He was very charismatic and outspoken. He wore an earring, and he wore these funny, cool sunglasses, and had his hair cut short and like in a mohawk, or not a mohawk, but he was outspoken and became famous, unusual, a famous college football linebacker. And at one point he got in trouble. I think he got kicked out of college. He ended up coming to the NFL, was signed by the Seattle Seahawks, and his NFL career wasn't that great. I think he got hurt. There was a famous play where Bo Jackson scored, and they made a big deal about it, that that he had sort of pushed Bosworth aside. But if you watch the tape, Bosworth did better than you would expect. And they had a nice ESPN special about Brian Bosworth in recent years, and he had his this is in like nowadays with his son, and he was crying in this program and talking about his father, who really pushed him in football. And he said something like, "Why couldn't my father have just loved me?" Because his father was obsessed with his football career, and a lot of fathers, kind of living through their sons and want them to succeed and become famous in sports, and it's this desire for fame, which is very commonplace among individuals. So Brian Bosworth, and actually I thought it was a very touching thing, this ESPN. And this book, he's a young man, he's very immature, kind of a know-it-all, and so an interesting story, Brian Bosworth. The next book is The Gulag Archipelago 2 by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, published in 1974. Now, when I read this, I thought I was done with the Gulag Archipelago. Little did I know there's a third volume. Anyway, this is more of the same, this unbelievable, horrendous prison camp system that the Russians set up, the Soviet Union, for political prisoners. Millions and millions were sent to Siberia, to these camps where they were like slaves working in doing different things in mining and so forth, and really as punishment, very, very terrible and cruel what they did. And people were arrested for just the smallest things. So it was really a police state, and everyone was really imprisoned. So, but I liked how Solzhenitsyn, he had this line from the book. He said, "Bless you, prison, for having been in my life." So he comes out and says, it actually helped him. He himself had been a prisoner. That's how he knew about this. He knew firsthand. And he came to believe that it helped him spiritually. What he went through helped his character, helped him become a more caring person, a more understanding person, more patience, and develop wisdom. And so he saw it as in a positive light. And I think that's a wonderful thing, if we can do that when we have hardships that come into our life. If we can see the purpose. I think there is a purpose for everything, because God is in control. God's the ruler of the universe, and He's our Father and Mother who loves us so much. So that means everything is designed to help us. We can't just expect to have good times all the time. There's got to be hard times. In this case, very, very hard times in the Gulag Archipelago in the Soviet Union years ago. The next book is The Other Mrs. Kennedy by Jerry Oppenheimer, published in 1994. This book is about Ethel Kennedy, who was the wife of Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. And, of course, they had 10 children. Ethel, Jackie Kennedy was the really glamorous one. She'd been the first lady and very demure. Now, Ethel was really different. Ethel was a very outspoken, kind of a regular person. And she had these 10 children, so that was really something. And, of course, her husband was killed at a young age, and that must have been very, very hard for her, because the children were young. She had these 10 children with no father. She had to raise without a father, and a number of them got into trouble. But she was a good person, kind of emotional, outspoken, and not so ladylike as Jackie, but very interesting person. Ethel Kennedy. The next book is Legends, The Story of Wyatt Earp by David Everett, published in 1988. And this book was lent to me by my good friend, Father Stan Plutz at Christ the King Seminary in Quezon City. And it's a corker of a book. And it really brings out the Wild West. Of course, Wyatt Earp was a famous sheriff, and the famous town, Dodge City, Kansas, like you heard the expression, "I need to get out of Dodge," and they talk about this town is too big for is too small for the two of us. And then Tombstone, Arizona, and then the showdown at the OK Corral, the gunfight. You heard about the OK Corral, where there was some fighting between individuals who had conflict. Bat Masterson was another famous character, and Doc Holliday. So this is the true story of the cowboy era. In Kansas, again, they were bringing cows they were on horseback, riding horses and herding these cattle up north to Kansas, Dodge City, Kansas. And you've seen these famous cowboy movies. So this is really the true story of these individuals from whom these famous cowboy movies have been made. The next book is Zero Coupon by Paul Erdman, published in 1993. Again, Erdman writes the financial thrillers, and his first book, The Crash of '79, was, I think, his best. And then it was like searching for the Holy Grail, finding something as good, and nothing really could compare to that first one. But again, he had a formula. He has a story involving characters and lots of money and exotic locations and theoretical or fictional financial catastrophe, which gets people's attention. Which could be, and when you think about it, who knows when something like this could happen, because the United States has a debt of like $20 trillion. So we'll have to see. Wait and see. That's how life is. We never know what's coming down the pike. The next book is After Many Days and Other Stories by Lucy Maud Montgomery, published around 1905. Well, this is a volume of short stories by the creator of Anne of Green Gables, Emily of New Moon, and Pat of Silverbush, set in Prince Edward Island, Canada, the early part of the 20th century. Stories of time passed by, the good old days, or the bad old days, good and bad old days, really. And so they're very wholesome, and stories of the rural time before modern life really came. And so they're very touching and nice stories. The next book is Cat's Eye by Margaret Atwood, published in 1988. So as it turns out, I did read another Margaret Atwood. I guess I'd forgotten about it. And she writes very well, writes good stories fine novels about contemporary life. And in this case, the narrator has a relationship with a character named Cordelia, who's her friend. And Cordelia is cruel and develops mental illness. Now, I think there's a correlation there. If you're a cruel person, the law of karma is true. God's perfect justice. Man's justice is imperfect. People think, oh, I can get away with something, and very often they do. But I don't believe that in the long term we get away with anything. That's why we should always try to do good things. And if you're a cruel person, it's really important to stop doing that. We need to be kind. If you are cruel, bad things will happen. And so this is a good example in this book that the cruel character develops mental illness. Margaret Atwood, a fine author. The next book is Into the Niger Bend by Jules Verne, published around 1900. Now, this is one of the obscure Jules Verne novels. Of course, the Niger River is in West Africa, and the sequel to this book is City in the Sahara. Now, this had some good geography of West Africa, Conakry, Sikasso, and especially Timbuktu. And the old expression used to be from here to Timbuktu, as in Timbuktu would be like the farthest place in the world, or the most remote area. And and then he also mentions Ouagadougou is the capital of Burkina Faso in West Africa, a country that I became very interested in. I have actually a good friend that I met here, immigrant to Cleveland from Burkina Faso. And so anyway, this is a Jules Verne novel set in West Africa, Into the Niger Bend, the Niger River. The next book is Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant by Ann Tyler, published in 1992. Yeah, Ann Tyler is just a wonderful current author. I believe she's still writing. She writes about family life, and in this novel, the father leaves, and then the mother has trouble coping. That's been pretty common. And then there's the angry son whose father isn't around, and then the attempts to have family dinners. That kind of reminds me of my own family. We have an idea. We want to have family life to be very nice, everyone getting along and loving and so forth. And family dinners are supposedly the time when people, eat and talk and have nice conversations and so forth. I always enjoy watching it on TV when you have these family dinners. And I believe in this novel, there is a restaurant, and then when you go there, you go and sit down, and then you don't order. They bring you what they think you need. So it's kind of a creative concept in this novel. I wonder if there's a restaurant that actually does this. So, Ann Tyler, fine novel, Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant. The next book is Tarzan and the Jewels of Upar by Edgar Rice Burroughs, published in 1919. This is number 5 of the Tarzan series, and it's a humdinger. Talk about action. Tarzan's wife, Jane, gets kidnapped. Tarzan lost his memory, and their home was destroyed, but everything was okay in the end. So that's the formula, because people want a happy ending. Tarzan and the Jewels of Upar. The next book is 20th Century Journey, a memoir of a life and the times, Volume 1, The Start, by William L. Shirer, published in 1976. Well, this is a true story about the author's life. He was a journalist, and he was in Europe, and he was specifically in Paris in the 1920s. So this was really something. To be young and in Paris in the 1920s, the Jazz Age, and the author met F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, and Gertrude Stein, and other famous intellectuals and authors, because this is where they used to go. It was considered, Paris was like this intellectual mecca where people like to go and congregate, and so it's very interesting. Book about the times, the 1920s, and meeting these famous authors who were so influential and did such a good job of recording that era. The next book is 20th Century Journey, a memoir of a life and the times, Volume 2, The Nightmare Years, by William L. Shirer, published in 1984. Well, Shirer is depicting here the rise of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, the rise to power of Hitler, and then of Mussolini in Italy. So you could tell hard times were coming, that this very evil force was coming to power in Europe, the rise of anti-Semitism and the drumbeats for war again, and it hadn't been that long before the First World War. So he was over there, and it was a very troubling time. That's why he calls it the nightmare years, and I believe it gets into the war itself, where they used to say the lights went off in Europe when Nazi Germany conquered basically all of Europe. One of the saddest photographs was the swastika, which was hung on the Eiffel Tower. So it was very, very hard. That's why he calls this the nightmare years. It was a real nightmare for folks in Europe in the Second World War, and folks in Asia who lived under the Japanese. The next book is 20th Century Journey, a memoir of a life and the times, Volume 3, A Native's Return, by William L. Shirer, published in 1990. So you can see I read these. This is a trilogy, and I read all three in order, 1, 2, 3. Now this is after the war, Second World War ended, and the author came back to the United States. And the thing is, he had real trouble, because when the war ended, the Cold War began, because we had this momentous clash with the Soviet Union and international communism. And in the United States, there had been a fair number of leftists who supported the Russian Revolution, who believed in communism, who were leftists, and Shirer ended up having trouble. Being persecuted, and some good people were. This is what happens. So it was pretty sad. And he makes the point in this book that after the war, the Germans had really inflicted a lot of suffering on people in Europe, and then after the war, of course, they themselves had suffered horrendously as well. So many of their own people had died, and their cities were destroyed, and then they really became a very hated people. People hated Germans. They thought, look how evil the German people are. And of course, that really wasn't fair, blaming everyone. But Shirer makes the point that there was a lot of support for Hitler's government, and he did some things that were right, or that worked. And I think after the First World War, the Germans really were depressed. They were blamed for the First World War, and so they had a sense of depression and failure and so forth. And Hitler and his government, instilled a sense of pride. Maybe that's what they like, but they just carried it too far. It's good to believe in your country, that you're a good country, but you should also respect other people, and that it was really tragic. And I think it was hard for Germans to admit how much they did support the Nazi government, because it was very, very painful. And then in the following years, as time passed, the teenagers and young adults of those who had supported the war and been involved in the war, they had severe conflict with their parents over, like, what did you do? Did you support Adolf Hitler? Did you support the Nazis? And it was very tough. And so very, very hard thing for that country and for all of Europe. The next book is The Afterlife and Other Stories by John Updike, published in 1994. This is a volume of short stories. I'm not really into short stories because, once you get a story, it starts, and then you get into it, and then before you know it, it's over. And it takes a while to get to learn characters in a novel. So with short stories, you're constantly trying to, orient yourself and figure out who's who, what's going on, who the people are, who the characters are, what the setting is, and so forth. So these are stories about growing old, and I guess at the time I wasn't really old enough to relate to it. Maybe I would now because I'm getting older myself now. I'm only 57, which isn't that old. And a friend of mine, Dr. Denko, wanted me to read this, and I wasn't really big on it. So anyway, the next book is The Bridget and Die by James A. Michener, published in 1957. I used to feel, now during these, as I was reading these books, I was teaching at Resalest Educational Center in the Philippines. I read this book in 1997, and I always used to have a sense of well-being that as a school year started, if I could read every time I read a James Michener, if I read one, it made me feel good about myself. And in this case, this was the first Michener I had read for the school year. And so this is a nonfiction. It's a story of what happened in Hungary in 1956. Of course, after aside from the Second World War and the tragedy of the war itself, what was really tragic was after the war how Eastern Europe fell under Russian and communist domination. All of the countries of Eastern Europe had to become communist and because of Russian pressure. And in 1956, the Hungarians revolted against their own government. They were fed up with communism and with the Russian domination, and they wanted to have a democratic country, and they wanted to be free of Russian influence. And then, well, very sadly, the Russians sent in their army and sent in the tanks, and they crushed that rebellion. So it was really tragic. I have a Hungarian friend who was involved in the uprising and left the country because he probably would have been arrested, perhaps killed. So it was tough, And Dwight Eisenhower was trying to figure. He was the president of the United States, trying to figure out what to do. What should we do? And what made things very hard was that the Russians had nuclear weapons, and everyone wanted to avoid nuclear war. So it was a tough situation. And of course, they had to wait till around 1990 before the Soviet Union ended and these countries could become democratic and they could throw off a communist government. The next book is Touching the Heart, Volume 3 by Peter Michael, published in 1995. And again, Peter Michael was my very good friend. He was a German Catholic priest who spent many years in the Philippines, and this is more of his stories in his work as a hospital chaplain, working with Filipinos who were sick and many of whom were dying. So it's a spiritual book. It's about his life and his work and trying to comfort people and in their hour of need. God bless Peter Michael, very good man. The next book is Journey to Jerusalem by Grace Halsell, published in 1981. This was a gift from a family friend who was Lebanese, and this gets into a real tough issue, which is namely the relations between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jewish people and Muslim people in what's called Israel or Palestine, places like the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights, and so it's been an ongoing thing, the relationship's been real tough, and so people have different opinions. Some people think, the Israelis are really terrible what they're doing, and others disagree. So it's a fascinating topic and something very important. Hopefully we can all learn to get along with each other, because that's really what we should be doing. So the next book is Two Against the Amazon by John Brown, published in 1953. This is a wonderful book. It's about an Englishman in the Amazon River Valley, or white man in the tropics. It's very funny. I love this line where the author wrote, quote, "Fancy if we had not penetrated the jungle and got these tape recordings, all traces of the Bongo Bongo 1,000-verse national anthem would have been lost. I always hope these recordings will be stolen or damaged." I thought that was very, very funny. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it, And I hope you find a good book to read. God bless you. God bless the Philippines, America, and the whole world. See you next time.